The cold winter of 1873 had been unforgiving in the mountains of Northern California, but nothing could have prepared Grace Lawson for the crack of ice beneath her feet as she fled across the frozen lake, the sounds of her pursuers' horses echoing through the pines behind her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the crystalline surface gave way, plunging her into the glacial waters that stole the breath from her lungs and numbed her limbs in seconds. Grace had never meant to find herself in this predicament. 6 months earlier, she had been living a comfortable life in San Francisco, working as a schoolteacher and living in a modest boarding house. At 23, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood after watching her friends marry one by one. Not that she minded, she enjoyed her independence and the freedom to pursue her own interests. That changed when her father's letter arrived, requesting she join him in the mining town of Silver Creek. Jonathan Lawson had left San Francisco 3 years prior to seek his fortune in the silver mines, sending money home regularly. His letters had grown increasingly enthusiastic about his prospects, and finally, he wanted his daughter to join him in what he described as a thriving community with opportunity aplenty. What Grace found upon arriving in Silver Creek was nothing like her father had described. The town was rough, dominated by the Silver Creek Mining Company and its owner, Theodore Blackburn. Her father had died just a week before her arrival, not in a mining accident as she was first told, but murdered, according to whispers from those brave enough to speak. "Your pa found something in those mines," Mrs. Holloway, the widow who ran the boarding house, had told her in hushed tones. Something Blackburn didn't want nobody knowing about. Grace had made the mistake of asking questions, of examining her father's papers, of speaking to the miners who had worked alongside him. She found discrepancies in the mine's records, evidence of claims that had been illegally seized, and a map marking a location deep in the mountains where her father had written, "The real motherlode, not silver." That's when Blackburn's men had come for her. Now, as the icy water closed over her head, Grace thought bitterly that she would never have the chance to expose the truth or obtain justice for her father. The cold was paralyzing, shocking her system as she struggled to surface. Her sodden woolen dress and coat dragged her down, and the current pulled her beneath the ice, away from the hole through which she had fallen. She clawed desperately at the underside of the ice, lungs burning, vision blurring, when suddenly there was light another hole, not far from where she had fallen. With her last reserves of strength, she swam toward it, breaking the surface with a desperate gasp. Hands strong, calloused hands gripped her arms and hauled her from the water. Through water-blurred eyes, she saw a man's face, weathered and concerned beneath the brim of a cowboy hat. "I've got you, miss," he said, his voice deep and steady as he pulled her completely from the lake. "Hold on." Grace could barely comprehend what was happening as he lifted her onto his horse and mounted behind her, supporting her limp form against his chest. She felt him wrap something around her, a heavy buffalo hide coat that enveloped her in warmth. "They're coming," she managed to whisper through chattering teeth. "I know," he replied, "but they won't find us where we're going." As consciousness slipped away, Grace felt the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the solid presence of the stranger at her back. She didn't know if she could trust him, but in that moment she had no choice. When Grace next opened her eyes, she was lying on a narrow cot in a small cabin. A fire roared in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn log walls. She was no longer in her wet clothes but wrapped in several thick blankets, with hot stones placed near her feet and sides. The man who had pulled her from the ice sat in a chair near the fire, cleaning a Winchester rifle. His face was partially illuminated by the flame's strong jaw covered in stubble, straight nose, and eyes that seemed to reflect the fire itself. "You're awake," he observed, setting the rifle aside. "How are you feeling?" Grace attempted to sit up but found her limbs still weak. "Cold," she managed. "But better. Where am I?" "My hunting cabin. About 15 miles from where you fell through." He stood and approached, carrying a steaming mug. "Drink this. It'll warm you from the inside." The mug contained a strong-smelling broth that burned pleasantly down her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin, Wade Irwin." He returned to his chair. "And you're Grace Lawson, Jonathan Lawson's daughter." Grace nearly dropped the mug. "How did you know that?" Small towns talk, especially when someone starts asking questions about Theodore Blackburn. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Your father was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him." "You knew my father," Wade nodded. "I did. We were partners once back when I still prospected, before I realized what kind of man Blackburn was." "Is that why you helped me? Because you knew my father?" "I helped you because you were drowning," he said simply. "The fact that you're Jonathan's daughter just means I have extra reason to keep you safe." Grace studied him more carefully. Wade Irwin appeared to be in his early 30s, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical labor. His hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with them, and his tanned face spoke of years spent outdoors. Yet there was something in his bearing that suggested he hadn't always been a frontiersman. "Those men," she said, "they work for Blackburn. I know. They've been watching you since you arrived in Silver Creek." Wade stood and added another log to the fire. "You found something in your father's papers, didn't you?" Grace hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger completely. But something in his straightforward manner and the fact that he had saved her life pushed her to honesty. "My father discovered a gold deposit, a significant one. But it wasn't on Blackburn's property. It was on land that's technically unclaimed." She shivered, despite the warmth of the cabin. "I think Blackburn killed him to keep it secret, to give himself time to find a way to claim that land." Wade nodded grimly. "That sounds like Blackburn. The man's empire is built on stolen claims and intimidation." He returned to sit across from her. "The question is, what do you plan to do now?" "I need to get to Sacramento," Grace replied. "My father sent copies of his findings to a friend at the land office there. If I can reach him before Blackburn's men do." "Sacramento's nearly 200 miles from here, through mountain country in the dead of winter," Wade interrupted. "And Blackburn's men will be watching every trail, every stage stop." "I don't have a choice," Grace insisted. "If I don't do this, my father died for nothing." Wade studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Then he sighed. "Rest tonight. You nearly died out there. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you to Sacramento." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I've got my own reasons for wanting to see Blackburn get what's coming to him." Grace wanted to ask more, but exhaustion pulled at her. As her eyes grew heavy, she realized that for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, she felt something close to safe. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Her clothes, now dry, had been placed on a chair near her cot, along with a flannel shirt and woolen pants that would clearly be too large for her. "They're mine," Wade said when he noticed her examining them. "But they'll be warmer than that dress for traveling, especially if we're going into the high country." "High country," Wade nodded as he transferred bacon from a cast iron skillet to a tin plate. "Blackburn's men will be watching the main trails. Our best chance is to cut through the mountains, then drop down to catch the stage at Murphy's Junction." Grace considered the pants with dubious fascination. She had never worn men's clothing in her life, but practicality outweighed propriety in these circumstances. Thank you. After breakfast, Wade outlined his plan. They would travel north through the mountains for 3 days, avoiding the main trails, before descending to Murphy's Junction where Grace could catch the stage to Sacramento. Wade would accompany her the entire way. "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked as she helped pack supplies. "You barely know me." Wade was silent for a long moment as he secured bags to his saddle. "Blackburn took something from me too," he finally said, his voice flat. "My brother worked in his mines. There was a collapse, 30 men died." The official story was that it was an accident, but Ellis, my brother, he'd been writing to me about unsafe conditions, about how Blackburn was cutting corners to increase profits. He tightened a strap with more force than necessary. "When I came asking questions, Blackburn's men made it clear I wasn't welcome. One night, they caught me alone, beat me within an inch of my life and told me if I valued what was left of it, I'd leave Silver Creek and never come back." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't in any condition to argue at the time." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. Wade shrugged, but she could see the pain and guilt he carried. "That was 2 years ago. I've been living up here since, trapping and hunting, keeping to myself." He met her eyes. "Your father found me about 6 months ago. Said he needed someone he could trust with what he'd discovered. We were supposed to meet the day after he was killed." Grace felt a fresh wave of grief. "He never mentioned you in his letters. He wouldn't have. We were being careful." Wade finished packing and turned to face her fully. "This isn't just about getting you to Sacramento safely, Grace. This is about finishing what your father started." There was something in his voice, a conviction that resonated with her own determination. Grace nodded. "Then we'd better get started." They left the cabin before noon, Wade leading the way on his horse with Grace riding behind him. The day was cold but clear, the snow-covered landscape stretching in pristine white waves toward distant mountains. Under different circumstances, Grace might have found the scenery breathtaking. As they rode, Wade pointed out landmarks and taught her to recognize signs of wildlife and weather changes. Despite the circumstances, Grace found herself drawn to his quiet confidence and knowledge. There was something comforting about his presence, solid and reliable in a world that had turned treacherous. "How did you know where to find me yesterday?" she asked as they paused to rest the horse. "When I fell through the ice." "I didn't," Wade admitted. "I'd been tracking a deer when I heard shouting. Went to investigate and saw Blackburn's men chasing someone across the lake. By the time I realized it was you, you'd already fallen through. You could have been killed helping me. They would have shot you." Wade's expression hardened. "They could have tried." The way he checked his rifle suggested he would have welcomed the confrontation. They made camp that evening in a sheltered ravine, far from any trail. Wade built a small fire, careful to keep the flames low to minimize visible smoke. As they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Grace found herself studying her companion in the firelight. There was a quiet strength to Wade Irwin that she found increasingly reassuring. Unlike the rough miners and businessmen of Silver Creek, he spoke with a certain refinement that suggested education, despite his frontier appearance. "Were you always a prospector?" she asked. A smile flickered across his face. "No, I was a lawyer back east, Boston." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Came west with Ellis after the war. He wanted adventure and I needed a change." "The war changed many people," Grace observed softly. Wade glanced up, something unreadable in his eyes. "You lost someone, my brother, at Gettysburg." Even after nearly 10 years, the pain of losing William remained sharp. They sat in companionable silence after that, united by shared losses. As the night deepened and stars emerged overhead, Grace felt a strange sense of peace despite their precarious situation. Perhaps it was simply the relief of having someone to share her burden. The next morning brought clouds and the threat of snow. They broke camp quickly and continued northward, the terrain growing steeper as they ascended into the mountains. By midday, light flakes were falling and the wind had picked up. "We need to find shelter before this gets worse," Wade said, scanning the ridges ahead. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles from here. We can wait out the storm there." The snow was falling more heavily by the time they reached the small, dilapidated cabin. It was little more than a single room with a rusted stove, but it would protect them from the elements. Wade quickly got a fire going while Grace arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the small space. As the day progressed, the storm intensified into a full blizzard. Wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to send drafts of frigid air inside. Despite the fire, the temperature dropped steadily. "This is going to delay us," Wade said, looking concerned as he peered through the cabin's single window at the whiteout conditions. "We can't travel in this." "How long do these storms usually last?" Grace asked, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "A day, maybe 2, he frowned. "But even when it stops, the snow will be deep. It'll slow us down considerably." Grace felt a flicker of despair. Every day of delay increased the chance that Blackburn would find them or worse, get to Sacramento first. "We'll make it," Wade said, as if reading her thoughts. "I promise you that." The storm raged through the night and into the next day. They rationed their supplies carefully, knowing they might be stranded longer than anticipated. To pass the time, they talked. Grace told Wade about her life in San Francisco, her work as a teacher, the books she loved. Wade spoke of his time as a lawyer, his service in the Union Army, and his decision to follow his brother west. "Ellis was always the adventurous one," he said, smiling at the memory. "I was the cautious brother, the one who followed the rules. And now you're helping a fugitive outrun a mining baron," Grace observed with a small smile of her own. "I guess some rules aren't worth following." His eyes met hers across the fire, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that transcended words. As night fell again and the cabin grew colder, Wade suggested they move their bedrolls closer to the stove for warmth. Grace knew it was a practical suggestion, but still felt a flutter of nervousness as they arranged their blankets side by side. "I'll keep the fire going through the night," Wade promised. "Try to get some sleep." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Grace. She was acutely aware of Wade's presence beside her, the sound of his breathing, the occasional creak of floorboards as he rose to add wood to the stove. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a confused tangle of ice water, pursuing horsemen, and the sensation of strong arms pulling her to safety. She woke just before dawn to find Wade's blanket empty. Panic surged through her until she spotted him at the window, rifle in hand. "Wade," she whispered, sitting up. "What is it?" He motioned for her to stay down. "Riders," he murmured. 3 of them moving slowly through the trees below. Grace's heart pounded. "Blackburn's men," Wade nodded grimly. "They're following our trail. The snow's stopped enough that they can see where we came up the ridge." He moved away from the window. "We need to leave. Now." They packed hurriedly, abandoning anything not essential. The storm had lessened to occasional flurries, but the snow lay deep on the ground. Wade led his horse from the small lean-to at the back of the cabin. "We can't outrun them in this," he said, checking the cinch on his saddle. "But I know these mountains better than they do. There's a narrow pass about a mile from here. If we can reach it, we can lose them in the higher valleys." They set out just as dawn broke, Wade breaking trail through knee-deep snow while leading his horse with Grace mounted. The going was painfully slow, each step requiring effort. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. "They're gaining on us," Grace said, glancing back anxiously. Wade didn't respond, but his pace quickened. The pass he had mentioned came into view ahead, a narrow gap between towering rock formations. Just as they reached it, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark from a tree beside them. "Go!" Wade shouted, helping Grace dismount and pushing her toward the pass. "Get through there and keep going. There's a fork about half a mile in. Take the left path." "What about you?" she demanded. Wade checked his rifle. "I'll hold them off, then follow." "No," Grace grabbed his arm. "I won't leave you, Grace." His voice softened as he met her eyes. "I need you safe. Your father trusted me to protect you." He pressed something into her hand, a folded paper. "If I don't make it, this map will get you to Murphy's Junction. Promise me you'll go." Before she could argue further, another shot whistled past. Wade pushed her toward the pass, then turned to face their pursuers, rifle raised. Grace hesitated only a moment before plunging into the narrow passage. The sound of gunfire erupted behind her, echoing off the rock walls. Each shot made her flinch, her imagination supplying terrible images of Wade falling, wounded or worse. She followed his directions, taking the left fork when the path split. The narrow trail wound upward, skirting a steep drop-off. The sounds of gunfire had stopped, leaving an ominous silence. Had Wade escaped? Or had Blackburn's men, a movement ahead, snapped her attention back to her surroundings? A figure emerged from behind a boulder, a man in a heavy coat, rifle in hand. One of Blackburn's men had circled around to cut her off. Grace froze, heart hammering. The man raised his rifle, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Miss Lawson," he called. "Mr. Blackburn would like a word with you about your father's papers." Grace backed away slowly. There was nowhere to run, the path was too narrow, the drop-off too steep. The man advanced, confident in his advantage. "Come quietly now," he continued. "No need for things to get unpleasant." A shot cracked through the air. The man's expression registered surprise, then he crumpled to the ground. Grace whirled to see Wade emerging from the path behind her, rifle still raised. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, quickly closing the distance between them. "No," she managed. "The others won't be following us." His expression was grim. "But there will be more. We need to keep moving." They continued through the mountains, the terrain growing increasingly difficult. By nightfall, they had reached a high valley sheltered by towering pines. Exhaustion had settled deep in Grace's bones, and even Wade, with all his stamina, moved with the heaviness of extreme fatigue. "We'll rest here," he decided, finding a spot where fallen logs created a natural windbreak. "Just for a few hours. It's too dangerous to build a fire, but we can share body heat." They huddled together beneath blankets and Wade's buffalo coat, the cold seeping through despite their combined warmth. Grace found herself pressed against Wade's chest, his arms around her, his steady heartbeat beneath her ear. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming back for me." His arms tightened slightly. "I would never have left you." Something in his voice made her look up. In the dim starlight filtering through the pines, she could just make out his features. There was an intensity in his gaze that caught her breath. "Wade," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle despite his calloused fingers. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow's going to be another hard day." She wanted to say more, to acknowledge the changing nature of what was growing between them, but exhaustion pulled her under before she could find the words. The next day brought clear skies and bitter cold. They set out at first light, Wade estimating they would reach Murphy's Junction by nightfall if they maintained a steady pace. The snow remained deep, but they had left the highest elevations, and the going was somewhat easier. As they traveled, Grace found her thoughts returning to the night before, to the feeling of Wade's arms around her, the look in his eyes when she'd thanked him. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, something unexpected had bloomed between them, a connection that transcended their shared purpose. "What will you do?" she asked as they paused to rest near midday. "After we reach Sacramento, after Blackburn is exposed." Wade was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the distant horizon. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For 2 years, all I've wanted was justice for Ellis. I never considered what would come after." "You could return to law," Grace suggested. "Your skills would be valuable in a growing state like California." A smile touched his lips. "Perhaps." He looked at her directly. "What about you? Will you return to teaching in San Francisco?" The question gave her pause. The life she had left behind seemed distant now, almost belonging to a different person. "I don't know," she said honestly. "So much has changed." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Grace knew that whatever future she chose, she wanted Wade Irwin to be part of it. The realization both thrilled and frightened her. They reached Murphy's Junction just as the sun was setting, the small settlement of a dozen buildings appearing almost abruptly after miles of wilderness. The stagecoach depot was the largest structure, flanked by a general store and a small saloon. "The stage to Sacramento comes through tomorrow morning," Wade said as they approached. "We'll get a room at the boarding house for the night." The proprietress of the boarding house, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Winslow, raised her eyebrows at the sight of them. Grace in men's clothing, both of them trail-worn and exhausted, but asked no questions beyond whether they preferred one room or two. "Two," Wade said quickly, avoiding Grace's eyes. "Adjoining if possible." Their rooms were small but clean, with actual beds that seemed like impossible luxury after days of sleeping on the ground. Grace washed as best she could with the basin of water provided, then changed back into her dress, which Mrs. Winslow had kindly pressed for her. Wade knocked softly on the connecting door just as she was finishing pinning up her hair. "Mrs. Winslow says there's supper if we want it," he said when she opened the door. He had also cleaned up, his hair damp from washing, his face freshly shaved. They ate in the small dining room downstairs, the only guests that evening. The hot meal, roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, was the best thing Grace had tasted in days. As they ate, Wade outlined the final stage of their journey. "The stage will get you to Sacramento by tomorrow evening. From there, you'll need to find your father's friend at the land office." He passed her a folded paper. "I've written down the directions to his office." Grace frowned. "You say you as if you won't be coming with me," Wade sighed, setting down his fork. "Grace, think about it. Blackburn will have men watching in Sacramento too. If we arrive together, it puts both of us at risk. It's better if I follow a day behind, taking a different route." "No," Grace said firmly. "We've come this far together. I'm not separating now." "It's the safest way." "I don't care about safe," she interrupted. "I care about finishing this together. You promised my father, you promised me." Wade studied her for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. Finally, he nodded. "Together, then." After dinner, they stepped outside for a breath of air. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead, the small settlement quiet except for muted piano music from the saloon down the street. "It seems strange," Grace mused, "to be back in civilization, even one as small as this." Wade nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "The wilderness has its own kind of peace." "Is that why you stayed?" she asked. "After what happened with Blackburn and your brother?" "The peace, partly," he admitted. "But mostly it was shame. I left without justice for Ellis. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd come back stronger, better prepared. But days turned into months and months into years." He looked away. "Your father showing up was like a second chance." Grace touched his arm. It's not too late. We're going to finish this. Wade turned to face her, his expression intense in the starlight. Grace, if something happens tomorrow, nothing will happen, she insisted. If it does, he continued, I need you to know that meeting you these past days together. He struggled for words. You've reminded me of who I used to be, who I want to be again. Grace's heart quickened. And who is that? A man who stands for something. A man worthy of. He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips. The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken feelings. Then Wade stepped back, breaking the spell. We should get some rest, he said, his voice rough. Tomorrow will be a long day. Grace nodded, disappointment mingling with anticipation. As she returned to her room, she knew that whatever happened in Sacramento, nothing would ever be the same between them again. Morning came with the sound of the stagecoach arriving, horses and harness jingling as the driver called out to the station manager. Grace and Wade had risen early, reviewing their plan over a quick breakfast. They would take the stage to Sacramento, locate her father's friend at the land office, and present the evidence of Blackburn's crimes. Once the authorities have the full story, they'll send marshals to Silver Creek, Wade explained. Blackburn won't be able to hide behind his money or influence anymore. They boarded the stagecoach alongside 3 other passengers, a traveling salesman, a young woman returning to her family in Sacramento, and an elderly gentleman who promptly fell asleep as soon as the coach lurched into motion. Grace sat beside Wade, acutely aware of his presence, the brief touches as the coach swayed around curves. The journey was long and jarring, the road rough despite recent improvements. They stopped at noon at a way station for a quick meal and to change horses, then continued westward as the terrain gradually flattened, the mountains receding behind them. Are you nervous? Wade asked quietly as the afternoon waned. Grace considered the question. Yes, she admitted. But not afraid, not anymore. His hand found hers between them, hidden from the other passenger's view, his fingers entwined with hers, warm and reassuring. Whatever happens, we face it together. They reached Sacramento just after dusk, the city's lights a stark contrast to the wilderness they had traversed. The stagecoach deposited them at the central depot, a bustling hub despite the evening hour. Wade secured rooms at a nearby hotel, and they agreed to visit the land office first thing in the morning. The hotel was considerably more luxurious than Mrs. Winslow's boarding house, with gas lighting and actual bathing rooms down the hall. After days in the wilderness, the hot bath Grace indulged in felt like heaven. Wearing a clean dress purchased hastily from a shop near the hotel, she felt almost like her old self again. Almost, but not quite. The woman who had arrived in Silver Creek searching for her father was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more determined and irrevocably drawn to the man who had saved her life and stood by her side through danger and hardship. Wade had cleaned up as well, trading his worn trail clothes for a proper suit that emphasized his height and broad shoulders. When he knocked on her door to escort her to dinner, Grace was struck anew by the transformation. This was the lawyer from Boston, not the mountain man who had pulled her from the ice. You look. He began, then shook his head slightly. There aren't words adequate enough. Grace felt warmth rise to her cheeks. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Irwin. They dined in the hotel restaurant, a far cry from their meals around campfires or at rustic tables. Over excellent food and a bottle of wine, they discussed the next day's plan. Grace would present her father's documents to Henry Crawford at the land office, while Wade would arrange for a meeting with the federal marshal. Crawford was my father's friend from their days in the gold fields, Grace explained. He's been with the land office for nearly 15 years. If anyone can help navigate the legal aspects, it's him. As the evening progressed, their conversation drifted from strategy to more personal topics. The wine and the relief of having reached Sacramento safely loosened their usual reserve. "You ever think about going back east?" Grace asked. "To Boston," Wade considered this. "I used to, in the early days out west when everything was strange and difficult." He smiled slightly. "But California gets in your blood, the freedom of it, the sense that anything is possible. Even for a woman," Grace asked, only half joking. "Especially for a woman like you." His eyes held hers. "You've shown more courage and determination than most men I've known." The compliment warmed her more than the wine. It helps to have the right companion. Something shifted in Wade's expression, a decision made, a threshold crossed. "Grace," he said softly, "when this is over, when Blackburn has faced justice, I'd like to." A commotion at the restaurant entrance interrupted him. 3 men had entered, scanning the room with obvious purpose. Grace recognized one immediately: Jack Harlow, Blackburn's chief enforcer, the man who had led the chase that ended with her plunging through the ice. "They've found us," she whispered, instinctively shrinking back. Wade didn't turn around, keeping his expression neutral. "The back door," he said quietly. "When I create a distraction, go through the kitchen and up to your room. Pack quickly, then use the service stairs to the alley behind the hotel. I'll meet you there in 10 minutes. Wade, trust me." His hand covered hers briefly. 10 minutes, Grace." Before she could protest further, Wade stood and deliberately knocked over a waiter passing with a tray of dishes. The crash was spectacular, sending china and glass shattering across the floor and drawing every eye in the restaurant. In the ensuing chaos, Grace slipped from her chair and through the swinging kitchen doors, ignoring the protests of the cook as she hurried through to the service exit. In her room, she threw her few belongings into her bag with shaking hands. Through the window, she could see figures moving in the street below, more of Blackburn's men, positioning themselves around the hotel. How had they found them so quickly? Someone must have telegraphed ahead from Murphy's Junction. Following Wade's instructions, she took the narrow service stairs down to the alley behind the hotel. The night air was cold after the warmth inside, and the alley was dark, lit only by distant street lamps at either end. Grace pressed herself against the wall, counting the minutes with mounting anxiety. 8 minutes had passed when she heard footsteps approaching, too many for just Wade. Grace retreated deeper into the shadows, heart pounding. 3 men appeared at the mouth of the alley, led by Harlow. "She came this way," one said. "The kitchen boy saw her." Grace looked desperately for an escape route. The alley was long with few doorways or side passages. If she ran, they would see her. If she remained, they would find her. Either way, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling her scream. "SHH," Wade's voice whispered in her ear. "It's me." Relief flooded through her as he pulled her into a recessed doorway, their bodies pressed close in the narrow space. Blackburn's men continued down the alley, passing within feet of their hiding place. "How did you find me?" Grace whispered once they had passed. "I know you," Wade answered simply. "Come on, we need to move quickly." He led her through a maze of back streets and alleys, avoiding main thoroughfares where Blackburn's men might be watching. Eventually, they reached a small, nondescript boarding house in a working-class neighborhood far from the hotel. "They won't look for us here," Wade said as he paid for a single room, introducing Grace as his wife to avoid raising suspicions. The room was small and spartanly furnished, with a single bed, a washstand, and a chair. Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the evening catching up with her. "They knew we were coming," she said. "How?" Wade shook his head, I'm not sure, but it changes our plan. It's not safe for you to go to the land office now. But we have to. I'll go," he interrupted. "Early, before they expect us to make a move. You'll stay here where it's safe." Grace stood, indignant. "We agreed to do this together." "That was before Blackburn's men nearly cornered us." Wade's expression softened at her frustrated look. "Grace, please. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you now, when we're so close." There was something in his voice, a depth of feeling that quieted her protests. She nodded reluctantly. "Be careful. Always." He hesitated, then added, "I should find somewhere else to sleep." The landlady mentioned a vacant room down the hall. "No," Grace said quickly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Stay, please." Wade's gaze held hers for a long moment. "Grace, I'm afraid," she admitted, though it was only partly true, "and I don't want to be alone tonight." He nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. They prepared for bed awkwardly, taking turns using the wash basin, carefully maintaining a respectful distance. When they finally lay side by side on the narrow mattress, Grace was acutely aware of Wade's presence, the warmth of him just inches away. "Try to sleep," he murmured. "Tomorrow will be an important day." Grace nodded in the darkness, though sleep seemed impossible with her mind racing and her heart hammering at Wade's proximity. She lay stiffly for several minutes, listening to his breathing. "Wade," she whispered. "Yes." "What were you going to say? In the restaurant before we were interrupted." He was silent for so long that Grace thought he might have fallen asleep. Then his hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I was going to say that I've grown to care for you, Grace Lawson, more than I thought possible in such a short time." His voice was low, intimate in the darkness. "And that I'd like the chance to see where these feelings might lead, once all this is behind us." Grace's heart soared at his words. She turned toward him, finding his face in the dim light filtering through the thin curtains. "I feel the same," she whispered. "From the moment you pulled me from that ice, something changed in me, in how I see the world, in what I want from life." Wade's hand gently cupped her cheek. "And what do you want, Grace?" Instead of answering with words, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Wade responded, his arm circling her waist to draw her closer. In that moment, the dangers they faced, the uncertainty of their future, all of it faded away, leaving only the two of them, finding in each other a shelter from the storm. When they finally broke apart, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since Murphy's Junction," he confessed. Grace smiled in the darkness. "I've wanted you to do that since the line shack." He laughed softly, then grew serious. "When this is over, when Blackburn is brought to justice, I want to court you properly, if you'll allow it." "I'd like that very much," she replied. She nestled against him, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. For the first time in weeks, Grace fell asleep feeling truly safe, truly at peace. Dawn came too quickly. Grace woke to find Wade already dressed, checking his revolver before tucking it into his waistband beneath his jacket. "I'll go to the land office as soon as it opens," he said. "With luck, Crawford will be there, and we can get the legal wheels turning immediately. I should be back by noon." Grace rose and quickly dressed, anxiety returning at the thought of Wade facing potential danger alone. What if Blackburn's men are watching the land office? "I'll be careful," he promised. "And I have this." He showed her a folded paper, her father's map and notes. "Even if they catch me, I'll make sure this gets to the right people." "That's not comforting," Grace said sharply. "I need you to come back safely, not just the documents." Wade's expression softened. He crossed to her and took her hands in his. "I will come back to you, Grace Lawson. That's a promise I intend to keep." He kissed her once more, lingering as if to memorize the feeling, then left. Grace moved to the window, watching as he strode purposefully down the street until he turned a corner and vanished from sight. The hours that followed were among the most difficult of Grace's life. She paced the small room, started at every sound from the street below, and fought against imagining all the things that could go wrong. Noon came and went with no sign of Wade. By mid-afternoon, her worry had transformed into full-blown fear. Just as she was considering venturing out to look for him, a foolish idea, but desperation was setting in, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Familiar footsteps. The door opened and Wade stepped in, his expression triumphant. "Crawford was there," he announced without preamble. "He remembered your father immediately. When I showed him the documents and explained what had happened, he sent for the federal marshal right away." Relief washed over Grace. "Then it's done. Blackburn will be arrested," Wade nodded. "The marshal is organizing a team to ride for Silver Creek tomorrow. Crawford is filing the proper documents to invalidate any claim Blackburn might make to your father's discovery." He crossed the room and took her hands. "It's over, Grace. Your father will have justice." The reality of their success took a moment to sink in. For weeks, Grace had been driven by a single purpose: to expose the truth about her father's murder and Blackburn's corruption. Now that it was accomplished, she felt almost adrift. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Wade's hands tightened on hers. "That depends on you. Crawford offered me a position with the land office. They need someone with legal training who understands mining claims. It would mean staying in Sacramento. And if I wanted to return to San Francisco, to teaching," a shadow crossed his face, "then I would visit as often as the stage runs, court you properly as I promised." Grace considered this, the possibilities stretching before her like paths in the wilderness. "What if I wanted something else entirely? A new beginning somewhere neither of us has been?" Wade studied her face. "Then we would make that beginning together." He hesitated. "Grace, I know it's soon. We've known each other barely 2 weeks, but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you. Whatever you choose, wherever you go, I want to be by your side." The declaration, simple and straightforward, filled Grace with a joy she hadn't believed possible after all the loss and danger she had endured. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling right, natural. "And I choose you, Wade Irwin. Whatever path we take together." He pulled her into his arms then, his kiss a promise and a beginning all at once. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony in Sacramento, with Henry Crawford as witness. By then, Theodore Blackburn had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, corruption, and murder. The trial was set for the summer, with both Wade and Grace scheduled to testify. They had decided to make their home in Sacramento, where Wade had accepted the position at the land office. Grace found work at a local school, though she harbored dreams of opening her own someday. The gold claim that had cost her father, his life was being properly developed, with a portion of the profits going to a fund for miners injured in unsafe conditions, a tribute to both Jonathan Lawson and Ellis Irwin. On a warm spring evening, as they sat on the porch of their modest home watching the sunset, Wade took Grace's hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. "You ever think about that day on the ice?" he asked. "How different things might have been if I hadn't been tracking that deer." "If I hadn't heard the shouting," Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "I prefer to think it was meant to be, that we were supposed to find each other even in those circumstances," she smiled. "Though I could have done without the freezing water." Wade laughed, drawing her closer. "I remember how you looked when I pulled you out half-drowned, shivering, but with such determination in your eyes. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even before you wrapped me in that buffalo coat." "Well, Maybe it was when you didn't complain once during that 3-day ride through the mountains, or when you stood up to me at Murphy's Junction, insisting we stay together." He kissed her temple. Or perhaps it was simply inevitable from the moment we met. Grace smiled, contentment washing over her. From the brink of death on that frozen lake to this peaceful porch, their journey had been extraordinary. Yet somehow she knew the greatest adventures still lay ahead of them. "I have news," she said after a moment. "I wasn't certain until today, so I wanted to wait before telling you." Wade straightened, turning to look at her. "News?" Grace placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby in the fall." The wonder that spread across Wade's face was something Grace knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He gathered her into his arms, laughing and crying at once, peppering her face with kisses. "A baby," he repeated, awestruck. "Our baby." As twilight deepened around them and the first stars appeared overhead, Grace Irwin thought about all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment: the tragedy of her father's death, the danger she had faced, the cold waters that had nearly claimed her life, and the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Life, like the western frontier itself, was unpredictable, sometimes harsh, often beautiful. But with Wade beside her, Grace faced the future unafraid, her heart as warm and secure as she had been in his arms that day on the frozen lake. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Wade taught their son Jonathan to ride his pony in the fenced paddock. Their 3-year-old daughter, Eleanor, sat on her hip, chattering about the wildflowers they had picked earlier that morning. The ranch, located in the foothills east of Sacramento, had been Wade's surprise to her on their 3rd anniversary. "A place of our own," he had said, "where our children can grow up knowing both wilderness and civilization." They had built it together, planning each detail, from the large windows that let in the morning light to the sprawling porch where they spent summer evenings. Wade still worked with the land office 3 days a week, but the rest of his time was devoted to the ranch and his family. Grace had opened her school 2 years earlier, a small but well-regarded establishment that served the children of neighboring ranches and farms. She taught 3 days a week, balancing her passion for education with her love for her growing family. As she watched Wade lift Jonathan from the pony and swing him high in the air, his laughter carrying across the yard, Grace felt a familiar swell of gratitude. The past 5 years had brought challenges: the difficult birth of Eleanor, a fire that had destroyed their first barn, Wade's brief illness the previous winter, but through it all, their bond had only strengthened. Theodore Blackburn had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Silver Creek had transformed under new management, with safer conditions for the miners and fair compensation for their work. The town that had once been a place of corruption and fear was slowly becoming a community. "Mama, look," Eleanor pointed as Wade and Jonathan approached, hand in hand. "Daddy and Johnny are coming." Grace smiled as her husband and son climbed the porch steps. Wade leaned down to kiss her, a ritual that still made her heart quicken after all these years. "I believe our son is a natural horseman," he announced proudly. "Takes after his mother." Grace laughed. "I think you're giving me too much credit. The only horse I managed to stay on was yours, and that was because you were holding me up." "I remember that ride differently," Wade teased. "I recall a very determined young woman who refused to rest despite nearly freezing to death." Jonathan tugged at his father's hand. "Tell the story, Pa, about how you saved Ma from the ice." It had become a family favorite, though Wade and Grace were careful to temper the more frightening aspects for their children's sake. They sat together on the porch swing, Eleanor on Grace's lap, Jonathan leaning against Wade's knee as they recounted the tale once more. "Your mother was the bravest woman I'd ever met," Wade said, his eyes meeting Grace's over their children's heads. Still is. Later, after the children were asleep, and they sat alone on the porch beneath a blanket of stars, Wade's arm around Grace's shoulders, they spoke of the future of Jonathan starting school in the fall, of the new foal expected in their small herd, of the possibility of adding another room to the house. "Are you happy, Grace?" Wade asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. "With this life we've built," Grace turned to look at him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, who had given her a love story more remarkable than any she could have imagined. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she answered honestly. "Every day when I wake up beside you, when I see our children growing, when I look out at this land that's ours, I think about how close I came to losing it all before I even knew it existed." Wade's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as they had countless times before. "That day on the ice," he said softly, "I was just following tracks. I had no idea I was tracking my own heart." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that the cold and fear of that distant winter day had led to the warmth and love of 1,000 days since. Their story, which had begun with ice and danger, had blossomed into something enduring and beautiful, a frontier love as vast and promising as the western sky above them.